Imagine being 9 years old, standing in a crowded courtroom, and the person begging you, crying, screaming your name is your own mother. Now imagine you open your mouth and condemn her to death. This is the true story of Jennet Device, a little girl who in 1612 testified against her own family, her mother, her brother, her sister, and sent them all to the gallows. And here's the thing that makes this story even darker. The law eventually came for her too. We're going to 1612, Lancashire, England, a remote, misty part of the country where people genuinely believed, that witches walked among them. And we're going to meet a 9-year-old girl who became the most powerful witness in one of England's most infamous witch trials. Let's get into it. First, some context, because you can't understand this story without understanding the world these people lived in. It's the early 1600s. King James I has just taken the throne, and this man was obsessed with witchcraft, wrote a whole book about it, obsessed. The book was called Demonology, and in it he basically encouraged the prosecution of anyone suspected of practicing dark magic. So across England, the fear of witches wasn't just superstition, it was government policy. Now, out in the rolling hills of Lancashire, in a place called Pendle, there were two families that everyone in the village whispered about, the Demdikes and the Chaddocks. Both families had women who acted as local healers, what we'd call herbalists or folk medicine practitioners today. Back then, people called them cunning folk. They made charms, brewed remedies, and yes, some of them probably played up the whole witch image because it made people pay them more. These two families hated each other. Decades of bad blood, accusations, and feuds. Think of them like the Hatfields and McCoys, but with added curses. The rivalry traced back to 1601, when someone from the Chaddocks family broke into the Devices' home, Malkin Tower, and stole goods worth roughly the equivalent of £200 today. A grudge like that doesn't die quietly. At the center of all this is one family in particular, the Devices. Elizabeth Device lived with her children, James, Alison, and the youngest, little Jennet. They were poor, desperately poor, and they lived under the shadow of Elizabeth's own mother, a woman known as Old Demdike, believed by the whole village to be the most powerful witch in the region. Demdike was in her 80s, nearly blind, and she had been practicing as a cunning woman for decades. So here's where things kick off. March 12, 1612. Alison Device, one of Jennet's older sisters, is walking through the forest when she runs into a traveling merchant named John Law. We don't know exactly what happened between them. Maybe she asked him for something and he refused. Maybe he insulted her. Whatever it was, Alison cursed him. Whether she truly believed she had the power to do it or it was just words spat in anger, we'll never know. But John Law collapsed shortly after. He suffered what was almost certainly a stroke. Half his body went paralyzed, and in a village already primed to believe in witchcraft, everyone immediately blamed Alison. Here's where it gets interesting. Alison herself seemed to believe she'd done it. She was brought before the local magistrate, a man named Roger Nowell, and she confessed. Not just to cursing John Law, she started talking about her grandmother, Old Demdike, about their family's practice of magic, about the Chaddocks family. One confession turned into a cascade. Old Demdike was arrested, the Chaddocks matriarch was arrested, more people were summoned, and then in April of 1612, Elizabeth Device, Jennet's mother, made a catastrophic mistake. She organized a gathering at their home, Malkin Tower, just a meeting of friends and family, she said, to discuss what was happening and how to help those who'd been arrested. To feed the guests, James even stole a neighbor's sheep. But when Roger Nowell found out about it, he saw it as a witch's coven, a conspiracy. 8 more people were arrested. The Device family, all of them basically, were now headed to Lancaster Castle to await trial. All of them, that is, except one, 9-year-old Jennet. The date was August 18th, 1612, and the place, Lancaster Castle. The courtroom is packed. Outside, people have traveled miles just to witness the spectacle. Inside, the accused stand. No lawyers, no right to call their own witnesses, just them and the judges and the testimony of those brought against them. And then the judges called their star witness. A little girl was brought into the room, Jennet Device, 9 years old. Now, in normal English law at this time, children under 14 weren't allowed to testify. Their testimony was considered unreliable. But King James had written that the usual rules of evidence shouldn't apply in witchcraft cases. The stakes were too high, he argued, too important. So Jennet was allowed to speak. And what happened next was one of the most harrowing scenes in English legal history. Elizabeth Device, Jennet's own mother, began to scream, crying, begging her daughter not to speak. The court record describes her as causing such a commotion that the judges had her physically removed from the room so Jennet could testify in peace. And then, in that now quiet courtroom, Jennet spoke. She testified against her mother, against her brother James, against her sister Allison. She described meetings, rituals, familiars, the whole thing. She even stood up in court, reportedly pointed at the accused and named them one by one. Her testimony was devastating. And when the courtroom finally fell quiet, 10 people had been found guilty. 10 people were hanged at Gallows Hill in Lancaster on August 20th, 1612. Elizabeth Device, Jennet's mother, James Device, Jennet's brother, Allison Device, Jennet's sister. 4 members of Jennet's immediate family dead, in large part because of what she said on that stand. Old Demdike, Jennet's grandmother, died in prison before the trial even concluded. The conditions at Lancaster Castle were brutal. Damp stone cells, no proper food, no medical care, and an elderly blind woman in her 80s simply didn't survive the wait. At 9 years old, Jennet Device had no family left. Now, if this story ended there, it would already be one of the most tragic in history. But it doesn't end there. Fast forward 20 years, it's 1633. Jennet Device is now a grown woman, probably in her late 20s or early 30s, and a 10-year-old boy named Edmund Robinson claims he's been terrorized by witches. He starts naming people. The accusations spread, and one of the names on his list is Jennet Device, the woman who as a child had testified against her own family using exactly this kind of accusation, was now on the receiving end of one. She was arrested. The cruel irony is almost too much to take. The very precedent she had helped set, that a child's word alone was enough to condemn someone for witchcraft, was now being used against her. The case was so extraordinary, it was referred all the way up to King Charles I himself. Under cross-examination, Edmund Robinson, the boy, admitted he'd fabricated everything. But that didn't free Jennet. She and the other accused remained locked in Lancaster Castle, the same castle her family had been imprisoned in 20 decades before. Records show she was still incarcerated as late as 1636. After that, the records go silent. She most likely died in that prison, the very place she, as a 9-year-old girl, had helped to send her mother. Before we talk about what all of this means, I want to shine a light on a few people in this story who don't get talked about enough. First, Alice Nutter. Among the 10 people hanged that August day, one stands completely apart. Alice Nutter was not a poor beggar woman living on the edge of survival. She was a wealthy widow, a landowner, a gentlewoman with her own estate in a village called Roughly.
The evidence against her? Almost nothing. Historians today believe she was most likely at Malkin Tower that Good Friday, not for a witches' coven, but because she was a secret Catholic passing through on her way to an illegal Catholic gathering. Her family was known to be loyal to the Catholic faith at a time when that was genuinely dangerous. She said nothing in her own defense throughout the entire trial, not to protect herself, but almost certainly to protect the other Catholics she'd been meeting with. To name them would have dragged more innocent people into the fire. And who sealed her fate? Jennet Device, who pointed at her in court and said she was there at Malkin Tower. Alice Nutter went to the gallows having said barely a word. Her only statement was, "Not guilty." She was hanged anyway. A statue of Alice Nutter stands in Roughly today, erected in 2012 on the 400th anniversary of the trials, as one of the few visible memorials to these victims. Her only statement was, "Not guilty." She was hanged anyway. Then there's the book. A court clerk named Thomas Potts published the entire trial proceedings in 1613 in a work called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster. It's the reason we know so much detail about this case compared to almost any other witch trial in history. But here's the catch. It was commissioned by the judges themselves, so the main historical source we have was written by someone with every reason to make the judges look righteous and the accused look guilty. Everything we know about Jennet's testimony, her mother's screaming, the pointing, all of it comes filtered through that lens. Take it for what it is. Here's the detail that stopped me cold. What happened at Pendle in 1612 didn't just end 10 lives in Lancashire. It set a legal precedent that echoed across the Atlantic, all the way to Salem, Massachusetts, 80 years later. Because of cases like this one, courts established that a child's testimony alone could be enough to condemn someone for witchcraft, that the normal rules of evidence didn't apply, that a small voice in a panic-filled courtroom carried the weight of a death sentence. When the Salem witch trials exploded in 1692, a group of young girls made accusations that sent 19 people to the gallows and left over 200 accused. Same mechanism, same logic. A child points, a crowd believes, people die. Pendle helped build the legal scaffolding that made Salem possible. And both of those events are symptoms of the same disease, a society so gripped by fear that it would accept almost any testimony to find a culprit, especially from the most vulnerable people in the room, children, the elderly, the desperately poor. That's not a 1600s problem, that's a human problem. So what do we actually make of Jennet Device? Was she a villain, a victim, both? Historians have gone back and forth on this for centuries. Some think she genuinely believed her family were witches and was terrified of them. Some think she was coerced, that the judges essentially coached a 9-year-old into saying what they needed her to say. Some might have felt like an outsider in her own family and saw this as her moment of power. The truth is probably some combination of all of it. What we can say for certain is this: Jennet Device was a child in an impossible situation, in a world that used her and then, when it was convenient, turned on her completely. She wasn't the monster, the system was. A system that executed 10 people on the testimony of neighbors, family members, and a little girl who may have had no idea what she was truly setting in motion. And then that same system swallowed her whole. The Pendle Witch Trials of 1612 are the most documented witch trial in English history, and Jennet Device sits right at the center of all of it, this tiny, complicated, heartbreaking figure. A girl who condemned her family, a woman who was condemned by history, a precedent that haunted a continent. If this story hit you the way it probably should, drop a comment below. Was Jennet a villain? Was she something more complicated than that? I genuinely want to know what you think.